Hello, my name is Emily Sigman, and this presentation is called The Myth of the Farmer, Confronting Consumer Demands for Cocoa Farming Interventions in Ghana. Open a bar of certified chocolate, such as Fairtrade, UTZ, or Rainforest Alliance, and you may encounter a picture of a smiling cocoa farmer, suggesting that the chocolate you are about to eat contains cocoa beans grown by the happy human on the wrapper. The images, coupled with the bean to bar or farm to bar narratives often printed beside them, conjure in the mind of the consumer a set of ideas about what cocoa farming entails and who cocoa farmers are. As presented, it is easy to imagine that there are individual people who identify as cocoa farmers, who own cocoa farms, grow cocoa trees, harvest cocoa beans, and sell them to people who make chocolate bars. In this presentation, I'm going to argue that in Ghana, the world's second largest producer of cocoa after its neighbor Cote d'Ivoire, these depictions of cocoa farmers can deviate significantly from reality. Such depictions eclipse important people and relationships in the cocoa production process, disserving both consumers who seek to understand the realities of their food system and producers whose work is obscured behind the veil of familiar but ultimately false narratives and who are often excluded from the promised benefits of certification. Cocoa is a charismatic crop. There's a lot of money that goes into researching it and a lot of activism around improving its supply chain. Probably a lot of you already know that cocoa, like many other tropical commodities, has kind of a bad track record when it comes to sustainability and inclusion. Just to give you a quick summary, cocoa is responsible for a lot of deforestation, especially in West Africa, where most of the world's cocoa is grown. Most of the cocoa is grown on small holdings, and in recent decades, people have argued that farmer poverty is at the root of the loss of forests. The Voice Network, a group of NGOs and trade unions working on sustainability issues in cocoa, estimates that out of every $1 spent on chocolate, only 6 cents goes back to the cocoa farmer. The continuing logic goes that because farmers are living on such marginal incomes, they have to resort to clearing more land to plant more trees and engaging in other activities like employing their young children in what can sometimes be dangerous cocoa farming tasks instead of sending them to school. Each year, the Voice Network produces an annual cocoa barometer report. This report offers a comprehensive analysis of current trends in the cocoa sector with a critical eye towards value chain equity and social justice. It serves to orient the annual partnership meeting of the World Cocoa Foundation, which is a yearly gathering where representatives from key nodes in the sector meet to take stock of the industry, advance supply chain improvements, and collaborate on social ecological projects. I used word count analysis to evaluate the 2020 Cocoa Barometer report, which itself is a synthesis of a lot of key literature, to give you an impression of the issues the sector currently perceives as the most relevant. Here it is. As you can see, cocoa unsurprisingly emerges as the highest weighted word. Farmers was the second weightiest word, signaling a clear sector focus on farmers. Labor, income, farm, and price came out as the next most frequently mentioned terms, signaling that these interrelated foci, that's farm labor, farmer incomes, farms, and cocoa prices, constitute the primary area of concern for the sector. The concern for farmer income outstripped concern about child labor, which was number 7, productivity, which was number 10, and environmental sustainability, which didn't even make it on the list, although agroforestry was number 15 and deforestation was number 16. What we get from this picture is that manufacturers and policymakers are paying attention to consumer fears about the cocoa supply chain. To go a bit deeper, I used qualitative deductive analysis to evaluate the proceedings from 2 recent cocoa industry summits, and I also conducted interviews with 45 people who I identified via stakeholder analysis as thought leaders and gatekeepers in the upper echelons of the cocoa sector. What I found is that chocolate companies, NGOs, and even governments are actually investing a lot of money in trying to fix the problem. Right now, that money is going towards certification programs aimed at increasing incomes for individual farmers. But is this the best place to intervene? That's what I wanted to find out. Here's a visual representation that I made about where these people think cocoa comes from and how they are collectively thinking about how to, quote, fix the cocoa problem. The figure reflects some commonly held consumer beliefs about the cocoa supply chain. That is, that it's a vertical system in which the farmer grows the beans, gets them ready for export, and then those beans are bought by greedy manufacturers who turn them into chocolate and take most of the profits, leaving the farmer below the line of a living income. From this vantage point, it seems like the best way to interrupt this negative pattern is to prevent manufacturers from taking all the money and instead sharing profits more evenly with farmers. Once farmers are able to make enough money, they can stop cutting down forests out of desperation, and they can extricate their children from cocoa labor. With improved incomes and extension support, the cocoa sector can even help farmers to adopt agroforestry practices, thereby turning landscapes that have been degraded by cocoa farming into opportunities for reforestation and restoration. Sounds pretty great, right? But it turns out that the cocoa production landscape is much more complicated. I also conducted field research in Ghana, and I spent time there not just with farmers, but with all kinds of other people who are part of the cocoa production process. I constructed a similar visual diagram to summarize the ways that cocoa production is viewed from the perspective of the local cocoa economy, and here's what that looks like. As you can see, this diagram is a lot more complicated. Instead of only 3 agents, farmers, manufacturers, and consumers, respondents identified 16 main agents of bean to bar production. These agents operate in concert with one another according to mandates and policies set by a government agency called the Ghana Cocoa Board, or COCOBOD for short. This agency is responsible for exporting all of Ghana's cocoa beans and plays a major role in coordinating cocoa production. Any interventions in the cocoa sector in Ghana must ultimately interact with this political entity. So in this framework, cocoa farming begins not on the farm, but at the Cocoa Research Institute of Ghana, or CRIG. And that's a department within COCOBOD that breeds and promotes the planting of specific cocoa hybrids. These hybrids grow into trees that are more disease resistant and bear fruit sooner and more abundantly, which is a good thing for an agency that derives its revenue from the sale of cocoa beans. Seeds from CRIG are generally not distributed directly to farmers, but instead to COCOBOD nurseries, where employees, some of whom live in nursery dormitories, grow out millions of seedlings. In the past, these seedlings were distributed directly to farmers, but increasingly the COCOBOD has been working with local extension agencies to recruit additional workers who travel to farms, clear the land, and plant the seedlings. Such teams continue to care for the cocoa seedlings for several years until they are fully established, though team membership typically changes throughout this period. After establishment, COCOBOD regularly provides free pruning, pesticide spraying, and fertilizing, again, contracting local teams to travel between farms and perform these tasks. In some areas, when the trees reach bearing age, teams coordinated by extension agents are sent to hand pollinate flowers, which ensures high yields because unfortunately natural pollination is on the decline. In instances where extension teams are not clearing, planting, and or tending, farmers often import hired labor or they work in groups. This is usually in more remote areas that are more difficult for the COCOBOD to reach. Many such farmers are themselves hired caretakers or sharecroppers, working land that is owned by an absentee farmer or owner who receives payment for the sale of the beans, but is not directly involved in the care of the trees. Then the harvesting of pods, the drying and fermenting of beans is also typically not the task of a single farmer, but rather is a multi-person undertaking, which involves, again, the contracting of paid labor or working in large coordinated groups. Beans are purchased directly by manufacturers only in very rare instances where they have been granted special license by the COCOBOD. The vast majority of beans are purchased by COCOBOD licensed buying companies, or LBCs. LBCs, including those representing COCOBOD directly, rely on what they call informal transport gangs to move 55-kilo sacks of cocoa from the collection station to the transport points. Additional transport gangs located at export or processing points then unload the bags into warehouses where they are often unbagged, washed, and sorted before being rebagged for export or sent into grinding facilities. When a consumer purchases a chocolate bar, the price they pay reflects all of the labor additions of the agents that I just detailed in that figure, not to mention others that I didn't describe, such as manufacturers, retailers, marketers, the list goes on. And that means that the flow of capital has no direct pathway back to farmers. And it's difficult to pinpoint to whom the term cocoa farmer would most meaningfully apply in this scenario. There's also not a single vector of capital. The figure shows capital entering at multiple points along the bean to bar process, while existing capital in the chain moves towards both ends of the spectrum. In this framework, problems manifest not just at the bottom of the value chain, but throughout much of the value-adding process. Vulnerabilities are prevalent at multiple sites throughout the framework, and increasing farmer incomes impacts only 4 of the 21 identified sites where individuals transforming beans into bars are not earning a living income. When I interviewed people who worked in cocoa nurseries and on extension teams and transport gangs and grinding facilities and ports, nearly all of them complained of the irregular nature of seasonal work. They also noted that the regularity of work was decreasing rather than increasing as the sector pays more attention to farmers. With their employment never guaranteed and no protections offered by part-time employers, these laborers are left perpetually scrambling to earn a living. So the current emphasis on farmers means that the higher price consumers pay for certified traceable chocolate gets directed towards people who own or manage land, despite the fact that there are more vulnerable actors in the chain. Most interventions to increase supply chain transparency almost ubiquitously involve collecting more personal information about cocoa farmers and their families. They do not make any mention, nor even seem to have any concept of who the other agents of cocoa farming communities are. Schemes do not propose tracking the incomes or outcomes of nursery workers, hired hands, buying company employees, transport gangs, stevedores, or any of the many teams of people organized through extension agencies to carry out essential cocoa farming tasks like, as we mentioned, weeding, pruning, fertilizing, spraying, pollinating, harvesting. But as we saw in the figure, these agents are not peripheral to the cocoa farming process. They are integral, they are central, and you could argue that they are central. Understanding the impact of price changes or other interventions in cocoa farming communities requires an appreciation for and understanding of all of these different people without whom cocoa farming would not be possible. While a handful of designated farmers may benefit from certification, everybody else misses out. Besides these farmers, certification benefits corporations. Though the chocolate industry is motivated by consumer demands and also really its own altruism, transparency also stands to help them gain a competitive advantage. And that's because most of the world's cocoa is traded in futures markets. All cocoa futures buyers must navigate an intricate game of speculation, weighing potentially overpaying for beans against running into a supply deficit. Corporations try to collect as much information as possible to help make these decisions. And the more transparent their supply chain, the more accurately they can forecast prices, which enables firms to reduce overspending and increase their profits. Certification also benefits the COCOBOD. The COCOBOD has a vested interest in better understanding the vast network of farmers that enliven its activities, particularly in the more remote areas where their resource centers are fewer and farther between. COCOBOD is actively working towards a more advanced and centralized tracing system, and they are more than eager to join in certification schemes that greenlight supply chain surveillance because that information helps them exercise their power. They can more easily intervene in cases where farmers are not employing their techniques, such as this could include like if a farmer is sowing their own saved seeds or using different amounts or different kinds of agrochemicals, or they're employing different weeding, pruning, and harvesting regimes, and the list goes on. So it's clear how a more traceable supply chain would benefit landowners, cocoa buyers, and government agencies, but it's less clear how it would impact the web of cocoa agents that are currently not making a living income. Demands for bean-to-bar transparency also have another shadow aspect, and that is that they reify a norm of non-consensual collection of personal information from private citizens. In all of the proposed tracking schemes, be they public or private, farmer consent was just assumed. Concerns about farmer consent did not appear once in any of the conference proceedings or subsequent interviews. And what I find most disturbing is a proposal that is widely lauded in the cocoa sector, which is to collect information on children in farming communities from birth until adulthood. And regardless of intent or outcome, I believe the sector should refrain from promoting non-consensual surveillance in farming communities and work instead to establish standards for how to obtain consent, how to collect personal data, and how to instrumentalize that data without compromising individual privacy or agency over it. Unfortunately, tracing programs are already well underway without these requisite considerations in play. As it stands, consumers, corporations, and governments are all benefiting from traceability at the expense of non-consensual data mining in farming communities. The cocoa sector should instead be working with governments to establish rights to producer privacy, including firmer policies on how, when, why, and on whom personal data can be collected, and place restrictions on who can access that data and for how long. Care should be taken to ensure that personal data remains the property of the individuals from whom it was obtained, and that affected people are empowered to understand what their rights are or could be, and how they can exercise or demand them. Consumers in places like the United States and Europe demand traceability from manufacturers who are using products from far away, often poor tropical places. And this is understandable. We believe that if we could just see where food comes from, we could find the kinks in the supply line that don't suit our ethics and intervene at those junctures to rectify the situation. We want to buy chocolate that makes us feel good, and we want to buy chocolate that can tell us a linear, uninterrupted story, one that can take us from bean to bar. But many of consumers of chocolate, at least those in a position to vote with their wallets and make demands on manufacturers, are coming from certain social frameworks that interpret the world as linear and hierarchical. But the truth is, reality isn't always linear. Sometimes our longing for bean to bar clarity can cause us to project myths about unitary farmers and linear supply chains in places where they might not actually exist. While I think individual rights should be promoted in the cocoa sector, individualistic frameworks about cocoa farming should not. Our demands for complete transparency in the cocoa supply chain are too often bound up in our hierarchical, individualistic mindsets that place mythical cocoa farmers at the bottom of an imaginary chain and identify them as the primary locus for intervention. But in a context where individual farmers comprise an increasingly smaller part of the cocoa production process, indeed when cocoa beans are not the fruit of one farmer's labor, but the emergent result of a collective effort, such interventions become somewhat chimerical. Transparency is not a panacea for sustainability, justice, or peace of mind. Impactful income interventions in the cocoa supply chain should look beyond the farmer and include contract labor and service work to ensure that higher farm gate prices and cocoa premiums from certification translate into increased stability and income for everyone involved in making chocolate. The taste of chocolate is lusciously complex. This is one of the many reasons why we love to let it melt in our mouths. As we walk the path of restoration, we need also to let this complexity melt in our minds. The search for complete transparency, the desire to know and thereby control everything, has obscured the value of complexity as we seek to deepen our relationships to food and improve our interconnected global food system. We can remember and take care of the many people who make cocoa production possible. And we consumers can also learn to see ourselves not as a terminus for the bean to bar story, but as part of a mutually embedded web of global relationships. Thank you.